in the SOU SLI program for a Master's in Teaching Spanish as a Foreign Language. Welcome to my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about two assessments that I gave this year in both my Spanish 1B and my Spanish 1A classes, and we're going to be evaluating them against the criteria in the rubric proposed in the articles that we read. So the first assessment is a summative assessment. In this assessment, students were told that they were trying to lobby their Spanish teacher to take students to Buenos Aires, Argentina, for an already planned study abroad trip where the destination had not yet been chosen. And in order to convince their teacher that Buenos Aires was a desirable study abroad destination, the students had to create a PowerPoint on Buenos Aires for the teacher that described some of the attractive features of the city, including monuments and other points of interest. And they had to describe things like the date, the time, the cost, the type of activity it was, and the location, using online resources to research and report on real-world activities that there are to do in Buenos Aires. So the first question is, was the assessment practical? The assessment was not really practical because although it was practical in terms of time needed to design it, it was not really practical in terms of the time required to grade 50 of these PowerPoints for my 8th graders. In terms of reliability, we're going to look at multiple dimensions of reliability. For rater reliability, it was reliable because I scored the projects using a 6-strand rubric that helped me consistently grade all the projects across the various students. In terms of the reliability of the test administration, it was not highly reliable, as although students were allowed to use notes and reference the exemplar in completing their projects, some students used Google Translate to complete their projects, and which is essentially cheating and doesn't show evidence of learning. So this factor was out of my control as the projects were done virtually. In terms of the test, the project was somewhat reliable as students' responses were open-ended. However, I provided a vocabulary reference sheet with sentence frames and possible vocabulary they could use to complete them, meaning they had some structure to craft their responses. Just to get a quick idea of what the assessment looked like, this is a finished product of a student, and you can see they're describing all sorts of different aspects of travel in Buenos Aires to make the case why they would want to go there. In terms of validity, the project was somewhat valid with regards to content. It was highly aligned to work we had to do in class in talking about places we wanted to go. However, it was not valid in that it required students to record themselves reading their presentation, and students were graded on pronunciation as part of the rubric, even though we hadn't explicitly practiced this in class. It was highly valid with regards to criterion. It was aligned to course objectives and standards for communicative performance. It was not really reliable with regards to, not really valid with regards to construct. There wasn't really a theoretical construct that was used to grade the performance task. For example, they should have been assessed on use of persuasive language for a presentation like this, yet that wasn't part of the assessment. For face validity, students generally did think the project was fair, and it accurately assessed what they knew. With regards to authenticity, it was not really valid with regards to authenticity. While students had a real-world context for creating the presentation, they didn't really have a true real-world language application of genre-specific language that would have made the task more authentic, for example, by using key phrases for making recommendations, which was not part of the project. I did have positive washback as a lot of students commented that this was one of the projects they enjoyed doing most over the course of the term. My second assessment was another summative assessment, this time given in my Spanish 1A class for seventh graders. And it came at the end of our unit on greetings and introductions. Students were told they had just gotten jobs as spies with the CIA, and in preparing for their first assignments abroad, they had to prepare and rehearse their new international identities. So they were given pictures of passports from Spanish-speaking countries, and they had to interpret key details about themselves, such as name, birthday, age, and then had to prepare their introduction for what they would actually say to the immigration officer at the airport. So the first criteria is practicality. It was very practical. Although there were various versions of the test, some open-ended questions, some converted to multiple choice for lower level learners. It was pretty straightforward to grade and pretty time efficient to prepare it. For rater reliability, it was somewhat reliable. I struggled to grade it consistently due to wide variations in how students responded to some open-ended questions, especially when asking about names, such as name on the passport, which, because of conventions in naming in Spanish-speaking countries, some students struggled with correctly identifying, for example, like the full name of the person. With regards to test administration, the assessment was also, I would say, somewhat reliable, mostly just because a handful of kids used Google Translate, so it wasn't, in that sense, a really accurate measure of learning. In terms of the test itself, the test was somewhat reliable. For the items on all versions of the test that were open-ended, again, the responses varied greatly. So, for example, in asking "Cómo te llamas?", some students responded with the full first and last name, others only with the first name, others only with the last name, because they weren't used to interpreting identification such as this. And so it wasn't clear if students really knew the test was asking for full first and last names. With regards to validity, for content validity, I would not say that this was valid with regards to content. Although the questions on the assessment were consistent with questions and responses kids had practiced before, the context was completely new, which was a mistake. So we had never actually looked at examples of identification or passports in Spanish-speaking countries. And so some kids struggled with being able to complete the assessment because they weren't used to answering questions, for example, about names used in this specific context. With regards to criterion validity, the test was 100% aligned to objectives and standards for the unit. So it was valid for criterion. It was not really valid for construct, as there was not really a construct that I had created or that I was using for really evaluating the overall results of the test. It was not also really valid for in terms of face validity, as there was some critique of the fairness by students that we had never before practiced interpreting identification. It was authentically valid in that there was a true real-world context for doing the assessment. And the washback, however, was somewhat negative, as students who struggled to complete the assessment came out of it with negative feelings about the class, as it reinforced the idea that they don't, quote unquote, get Spanish. And it wasn't super ethical because kids should have had practice interpreting IDs prior in order to set them up for success on the assessment itself. In terms of accessibility, it was highly accessible, as all students were able to access and work on the assessment online.